We've got now a good time maybe to start, maybe. Right. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. It's a bit of a balmy evening in London. I don't know where everyone else is, but it's rather hot here. So welcome to this evening's John Schofield Trust Masterclass. So my name's Zaber Malik. I am the chair of the trust. And I'm sure many of you will know that our mission is very much to improve diversity within newsrooms. So there is indeed a better and a true reflection in journalism and the news output, so it appeals and speaks to much broader audiences. And I suppose in the week running up to the election, that's absolutely kind of just as critical as it is at any other time. And this masterclass is indeed partly about class. I'm delighted that we have Gary Younge joining us this evening. Thank you very much, Gary, for giving up your evening and joining us. So Gary will be taking questions from our panel. So on the panel, we have Georgia, Oliver, and Sasha. So three of you will be in control for the first 40 minutes, asking Gary questions, and then we'll come to audience questions for the final 20 minutes as well. So we've got about an hour on this, running up to about 7:30. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat box, in the chat function, and we'll come to those. Or if you're happy to raise them yourselves, please raise your hands and we'll come to you so you can ask Gary your question directly as well. Just to remind you, this is being recorded and may be shared on various social media platforms by the trust. So obviously now we come to Gary. So Gary, as I'm sure many of you also know, is an award-winning journalist, author, broadcaster, and an academic. So you're a professor of sociology at the University of Manchester, as well as visiting professor at the London South Bank University, formerly a columnist and editor-at-large at The Guardian. You're an editorial board member of The Nation magazine, the Alfred Nobler Fellow for Type Media, and winner of the 2023 Orwell Prize for Journalism. Gary's written several books, including The Speech, The Story Behind Martin Luther King's Dream, and Dispatches from the Diaspora. You've made several radio and TV documentaries. And obviously, I'm looking at diversity and kind of sociological aspect. Hopefully we'll hear from you for the next hour about your personal experiences in journalism, of course, your writing and your academic work as well. So thank you, Gary. So we'll go over to Georgia. Georgia, if you could kindly introduce yourself and maybe, and then we'll come to Oliver and Sasha, if you could introduce yourselves, and then Georgia will come back to you for the first question, if that's okay.
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. So my name is Georgia Cohn, and I am a journalist and podcast producer currently at The Telegraph. I was previously at the BBC, where I did my apprenticeship, and I've been in the industry for 8 years now, which seems insane to me. And I work in mainly daily news podcasts. So I'm currently working on The Telegraph's new podcast that they've just launched called The Daily Tea. So yeah, I do a bit of everything really, but it's a really good experience so far. And I'm also very passionate about diversity in terms of social economic diversity, especially, which is very close to my heart and something that I speak a lot about on social media. So yeah, I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to speak to Gary about that.
Great. Oliver, over to you.
Thanks, Ivor. Hi, everyone. My name's Oliver Murphy. I'm a reporter with NewsQuest Cambridgeshire. I specialise specifically in human interest investigations and data journalism. Like George, I have a real passion for equality, particularly in the LGBTQ+ sphere. In the industry for about 5 years now. Before I started at NewsQuest, I was a freelancer at Metro. A lot of LGBT coverage, specifically the plight of LGBT Afghans after the Taliban's brutal takeover.
Hello everyone, my name is Sasha Wiltshire and I'm not a journalist yet, but I am just finished my second year of journalism at the University of Central Lancashire and going into my third year. And diversity has always been important to me as someone who has had type 1 diabetes for a year and a woman of colour. It's really important for me to be that representation for other people so that they can feel heard and seen. So I'm really looking forward to getting to question Gary about that.
Grand, thank you.
Okay.
So should I take on the first section?
That would be great. So I think we're going to ask a few questions from each of you, if that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Gary, I think it would be really interesting. I love to ask this question of people because I just feel like everyone gives me a different answer. But do you remember the moment that you decided that you wanted to become a journalist and kind of what inspired that desire to make it into a career?
I'll be honest with you, I remember the process, not the moment, although there was a moment that I will describe, but that I was very precocious politically. I'd been involved in the Trotskyist movement when I was 15. I got kicked out when I was 16. I was picketing the South African embassy. I was very involved politically. And then I went to university to study languages, to study translation. And I didn't love translation and I wasn't very good at it, but it did teach me about the power of language and the skill of manipulating language. That translation and interpreting is like, well, what does that mean? What are we trying to say here? You know, and you're taking one language and putting it into another. And those two things kind of came together. Now, I was very politically involved at university, and at that time, too arrogant actually to think that I would be a journalist. I thought I wanted people to write about me, not write about them. But we were running a rent strike. The Scotsman's education correspondent, because this was in Edinburgh, came to cover us, and he asked if I'd be interested in working for the student supplement. And I initially thought no, because I was arrogant. And then it got to summer, and I thought, oh, maybe. And I sent a few ideas, most of which I think all bar two were rejected. And I did this piece, 2 pieces. If I was paid by the hour, I'd have been better paid at Burger King. Like, it was really hard. And but I enjoyed it. And it was a different way of writing, different way of thinking than I was used to. And the moment was I was just about to leave to go for my year abroad in France and Russia, when the supplement came out, and I got a check, and it wasn't very much. It was like 45 quid, but it was the first thing that I'd done that I enjoyed, that I got a check for, that I could see maybe being more interested and differently interested in doing it. And I guess if there was a moment, it would have been there, but there were many little bits that built up to that. So yeah, that would be when and how.
I guess that leads on quite nicely to the next question that I wanted to ask, because I know that you were awarded a bursary from The Guardian to study journalism at City University. Do you think that you would have been able to pursue a career in journalism had you not got that bursary, especially coming from a working class background?
Oh, I know for a fact that I wouldn't have taken the route I took. I don't know what I would have done. I wasn't overburdened with plans, particularly at the end of my course. I think if I hadn't got that bursary, which was a real shot in the dark for me, because my university didn't even have a newspaper for most of the time I was there, I think I would have gone and done some teaching abroad and written occasionally, and this was still pre-internet, or it was for me, sort of sent things off. but no, I wouldn't have. I had no parental support. My mum was dead. My dad left when I was 1 and was not a feature in my life. There wasn't the means. I graduated at a time when you could still graduate without debt. I had a full grant. I had to get a job. And so without the financial support, and I would go one step further actually, which is that The Guardian in its advert said we particularly encourage people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And honestly, I don't know if I'd applied if I hadn't said that, because my understanding of who journalists were was that they were posh white dudes. And so it never kind of particularly occurred to me that I would have been able to make a living through writing. So no, it probably wouldn't have happened, and it definitely wouldn't have happened in the same way.
And also, in terms of when you first started in the newsroom, what were your experiences, I guess, in terms of the socio-economic makeup of The Guardian at that time? We know that journalism is certainly not as diverse as it could be now, but I imagine it at that time was probably even more difficult. Did you have any experiences of, feeling as though you kind of didn't fit into the newsroom, or, you felt as though at that point that people weren't really from the same backgrounds as you?
Yeah, not just starting out, actually, for most of my time as a journalist. Although, the truth is that Britain is a very class-ridden society and a very racist society, so among other things. So I don't know that, having got through the education system and got a degree, I don't know that the counterfactual of what it would have been like if I joined the civil service or joined, do you know what I mean, a banking career or whatever, that it wouldn't have been similar. My memory is that as time went on, newsrooms became more diverse in terms of sex and race and less diverse in terms of class. That when I started, you were still in the period where people could come into journalism through local newspapers and stuff like that, as opposed to as a graduate kind of as a graduate path. So, and it's not like it was like really working class, but it was more so than I remember, when I left. But it was basically white and overwhelmingly male. And that other thing also made it more, it felt more diverse in terms of region as well, not just people from the southeast. And it kind of, the whole, like I said, I don't know that it wouldn't have been like that elsewhere, but the whole time you were navigating, well, I don't know anything about that, but I do know about this. I remember when Pride and Prejudice The Guardian did a story about Pride and Prejudice and how the Radio Times had given away the ending because it had a picture of Lizzie and Mr. Darcy in a carriage. They were obviously getting married, and someone said, like, as if we didn't know. And I muttered to myself, well, I didn't fucking know, because I hadn't read Pride and Prejudice. But I said it a bit too loud. And they're like, you didn't know, you haven't read Pride and Prejudice. And I remember just thinking, fuck off. You haven't read the works of Maya Angelou or the full works of Alice Walker or Chester Himes. Like, your reference points are my reference points, but I do have reference points. So that was, that was, it was just one example. It was a small example, but it was, that was always around. And I would just emphasize, I was a working class Black kid moving into a middle class spheres. I don't know that it would have been different if I'd gone into a different sector, but I don't know how different.
Mm. Well, my last question was actually in regards to your move to the US and working in newsrooms in the US. Would you say that there is a difference between journalism in the UK and the US in terms of social diversity and diversity in general, I guess?
There is. I mean, my first experience of working in the US was that I got the Lawrence Stern Fellowship, and that's at the Washington Post, which is a city that's 70% Black. And that was a real head turn for me, because I became Brother Gary. That was, what I was called in the and African American. I was the first Black person to have got the Lawrence Stern Fellowship, and they would like take me on laps of honor, and they would introduce me to different colleagues, and I kind of was, so I got kind of express track to some of the most senior people who I probably wouldn't have met otherwise, but who were Black in the office. It was a much Blacker office than you would have got even at the New York Times or somewhere else. So there was that. Social class is a lot more difficult to read in America, in general, but the culture felt more like the civil service than a UK journalistic culture. It was quite buttoned up and buttoned down, and they took themselves very seriously in a way that British journalists don't, for worse more than for better, I think. So yeah, it was quite different, and mostly I experienced that in terms of race, and that is primarily because the class aspect was I didn't speak class fluently in America, whereas race, I could, and I speak class fluently here. I know the cues and the ticks and all the rest of it, and I was less across it, but it did feel different. Definitely felt different.
It's really interesting. Thank you, Gary. And I will pass on to Oliver now.
Thank you, George, and Gary, thank you again for joining us this evening. If I may, I want to move on to journalism as a craft. As I'm sure you'll know, every question, every journalist will ask themselves the question, what makes that perfect story? And looking back on the stories that you've covered and stories that have come to define your career, what elements do you consider crucial when you take a seed of an idea and then nurture it into a fully fledged story?
I think a couple of things. One is, the main thing is, what am I adding here? Which sometimes you're not adding anything, really. You're just doing it because it's the thing on the roster. Everybody's doing it. The fact that you're doing it really, you're adding something to the Guardian's pages, but you're not adding anything to human knowledge particularly. So where you're adding something, where you are contributing something, and it quite often, more often than not, it's small things, it's small observations, it's a particular quote that highlights a particular thing that you're interested in. It's a particular phone call that you've made. It's a particular stat that you found that just brings something new. It doesn't. I don't want to overegg that, because we're doing this every day, right? Or I was, or we're doing it regularly. So there's only so much new stuff you're ever going to find in a moment. But I would say, well, I'm trying to avoid things that are formulaic. So, I found things like when Obama won in 2008, when he won the presidency, I thought the last place I want to be is in Grant Park, which was where he kind of came out with his family, because everybody will be there. And there is nothing, there's really not going to be much for me to add. What am I bringing to this? And so I watched the whole thing, the whole night, from a bar in the South Side, which is where African Americans lived, and wrote about their responses to this moment, thinking, well, everyone will have seen this by the time they got up, but how is this being understood? And that was, I'm not making any great claims for it, but that was me trying to provide something new and different. And that quite often, and let's say party conferences are a good example of this, where things are set up for the media. And I always think that's the last place the media should be, in a place where things are set up for them. So that would be my answer. The kind of, and in the perfect story, you go somewhere, you find something else, you find something out that nobody, well, somebody knows it, but that hasn't been reported before. It may not, I broke very few stories in terms of exclusives in that sense, but you get to talk to someone who's not been talked to before. And as a result of that, just trying to just kind of shift people's understanding. So one last example would be in Ohio during the 2004 election. There was a thing about values and values and class. I think, like, are people voting with their money or with their values? So poor people in America who vote a certain vote Republican because even though they're going to be worse off, they against abortion or against gay rights or whatever. And in the reporting of that story, I went to a gay bar. It seemed like an obvious place to go, because gay marriage was on the docket. And I got speaking to a gay steelworker and I had a really good conversation with him about the conversations he has on the shop floor and so on and so forth. It was probably just a couple of lines in the piece, but for me, which is kind of in a way all that matters in a sense, it stopped that bifurcation of like, well, there's gay people and there's steel workers. It's like, well, no, and I wasn't looking for a gay steel worker, but kind of it's also true that nobody else found a gay steel worker or someone who worked in a steel mill who'd had an abortion, or so nobody was doing that kind of intersectional stuff.
I want to hone in more on what you were talking about adding more. What can you add? Because I think that's an important point. Do you feel that stories could be more powerful when the journalist themselves features their own personal experience? I mean, your Guardian column, I think what COVID taught us about racism and what we can do, you started by weaving in personal anecdote there. Do you feel when the journalist brings their own experiences forward that can lend the piece additional weight? It can make audiences relate more to the issue.
I think it definitely can, but it doesn't necessarily. And it depends on how relevant it is, really. It depends on the relevance of your personal experience and your personal story. I've never been of the view that a journalist should keep themselves out of a story at all costs. If you have an experience which speaks to the thing that you're writing about, I think it is odd to keep it to yourself. But I also think there has to be a very good reason for you to do it. And sometimes the reason is, this was the point at which I realized there was something going on. That these ideas that one has. So the story about COVID, which I think starts with me going to a certain demonstration. and realizing nobody's taking names here. I don't know where this demonstration came from. And it was a Black Lives Matter demonstration, and giving that as an example that kind of we'd had this explosion of anti-racist activity, but there were no structures to sustain it. And the best way to illustrate that, I thought, was through this experience I had of going to a demonstration that was organized through Facebook, where nobody took any names. I have no idea who organized it. And then we all went home. And then just kind of, unpacking that. But it has to be relevant. I used to say about the kind of lifestyle columns that people write. So I don't mind if people write about what's in their fridge or what they did on Saturday night. But what they did on Saturday night has to be much more interesting than what I did on Saturday night for me to want to read about it. Otherwise, do you know what I mean? Why are you telling me about it? And that kind of quite often, and I'm sure even in my work, sometimes the personal anecdote isn't worth it. It doesn't do its job.
Let's take a look at your book, Another Day in the Death of America, a fantastic piece, which really highlights America's problem with gun control. Talk me through the process of how you came up with that idea and then turned it into a piece of journalism that was eventually shortlisted for the Orwell Prize.
Well, so the book is about all of the kids who were shot dead in one day in America on a random day. And the truth was, and I do write this, I think in the, I'm only saying this because I don't want to pass somebody else's idea off as my own. It starts as a commission for the Weekend magazine in 2007. And in the process, which is passed to me because the person they gave it to couldn't do it. And in the process of doing this article, I just think this could be a book, and it's a book about America. It took me to Las Vegas, Virginia, the South, the kind of, Michigan. I thought this is a snapshot of what this country is like, but through these tragedies. So I thought in 2007, this could be a book. I also started researching it just when I had a kid. And then I had another kid, and I was also in the middle of another book, and then I wrote another book, and then but I always thought that, and then a publisher asked my agent, does he have a gun book in him? Because there'd been every bloody 6 weeks or so there was a gun tragedy in America, and maybe every few months they reach Britain. And I said immediately, well, there is this that I've always wanted to do, and they got it immediately. It's it's not a difficult concept. So that was how it came about. And then in the doing of it was a real kind of, I learned a lot about journalism by doing it, because you had to get people to trust you, to talk to you. It's not that I mean, by that time I've been a journalist for a good 15, 20 years. Yeah, but not in sort of such a sustained way. And so combing through, trying to recreate these kids' lives, trying to get people to talk to you about them. It was a whole thing of like, well, I'm gonna send them a book that I've written, so they know that I do actually write books. And I spent ages on the letter that I sent them. I tried to never cold call anybody, but it did involve walking up and knocking on people's houses and saying, do you know where so-and-so lives? So it was some real shoe leather. It was some real shoe leather stuff. And I didn't enjoy it in terms of the subject matter, but in terms of the process, it invigorating, and journalistically, it was rejuvenating. It kind of you're economists, you can read books and kind of you can get away with a style of discourse that doesn't demand you necessarily engaging with the world around you, and this was the absolute opposite.
Well, Gary, thank you so much for answering my questions. Really appreciate it. I'm going to pass on to Sasha now.
Hi, Sasha.
Hello, thank you, Oliver. So, like I was kind of speaking about before about diversity, because that's very important to me, is being that representation. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. So being a part of an underrepresented background, what did you personally find was the most challenging thing as part of your career?
The most challenging thing has definitely been maintaining a sense of authenticity about what it is that I want to do. That from the very beginning, I was told, either don't write about race, you will be pigeonholed, always in the passive voice. So you never know who's pigeonholing you, just you will be. Or you can only write about race. So the first column I ever did was spiked initially because it was about Bosnia. And I was told, we have people who can do that. And my challenge was to say, look, I will write best about the things that I'm interested in and that I'm passionate about. And of course, I couldn't say that when I was 25, because first of all, I hadn't been through the process that would find that articulation. But secondly, I was a very junior person. So I had to, I had to take in a lot of water before I learned to swim rather than sink. But that ability to which and you don't always win those battles, by the way, but to I want to say impose, but that's not quite the right word. But for now, let's say impose my will. No, I don't think that's a good idea. I think we should do it like that. I think we should do it like this. And to do that in a way that was that could persuade someone with more power than me to let me do that. And like I say, I didn't always win those battles. But that also meant at times it did mean, for want of a better word, throwing down. It did mean saying, I'm not going to do that. At the end of my first internship at the World This Week, which was a sort of magazine program, TV programs, the first job I had after City, I was asked to call the Front National, who were polling about 9% at the time, and get them on the show. And because I spoke French, that was my job. And I took a walk around. It was the last week of my probationary period, and I took a walk around the block. But my view was, you shouldn't have them on your show. They're polling at 9%. You are making them respectable, and you're doing it because you're going to get a kick out of it, and you think it's kind of clever and funny, but it's not funny. They're fascists, and I'm not. My feeling was, if I start my career by doing things like this, then where am I going to end up? So I, took a walk around the block and then came back. And this is where kind of having been a Trotskyist kind of really helps, because I'm really clear about a line of command. And I said to him, look, I realize I'm being insubordinate, and I understand that there are consequences, but I'm not going to do this, and this is why. And I also thought, you're not paying me enough to do this. The stakes are too low for me. But that speaks to the original point. Like there has to be some red lines for people. But it doesn't mean that I didn't do it. But I never did anything that I was ashamed of. But I did do stories where I thought, this isn't good. This doesn't make sense. But it's like the Hippocratic Oath. The first thing is to do no harm. I'm not sure that I did anything that did anybody any harm. I did quite a lot of things that I would never read myself. But that's not just regarding race. That's just a lot of journalism's crap.
Thank you. And I can imagine that you may have received some unfriendly comments over the years due to the color of your skin. What advice would you give to future generations of aspiring journalists dealing with the same issue?
Well, I mean, everybody's gonna have their own way of understanding these things. Over the years, my thing is I've developed a thick skin, but tried to keep an open heart. And you know, when I got into journalism, it's not like racial abuse was something I'd never experienced before. Right? I've been beaten up by the cops in France. I've been chased by men with baseball bats in Edinburgh. It was like, so someone calling me names, you know, came with the territory. Getting the bursary, the Guardian bursary, which in my year there were 6 of us. 3 were non-white, and 3 were white women. And there were, you know, there were fellow students who were like, well, you only got in because you were black. And I, you know, I feel, and I said, well, why did you get in? How do you know why you go in? What do you know, what makes you so special? And my general view about this stuff, when I've interviewed people who are older, talking about their experiences, is that the people who have some political understanding of the space that they occupy survive better, because they don't think this is about me. They understand that this is part of a broader structural kind of problem going back centuries, and so they learn, even though the things are being directed at you, to kind of understand it structurally rather than personally. And my view is that you live longer and happier when you can do that. It's not always easy. What is really hard, is dealing with racial slights from your colleagues. That's hard, because these are the people that you're going into the trenches with, in a way. And these are people who you think know you, and who you may rely on, and who you may have helped, and who may have helped you. And that happened more than once. That I found very hard. And particularly, I would say, also with the social media and whatnot, because when I started out, I was much less available than people are now. Is that you have to take the praise like you take the criticism. You can't be like, I don't care what people say about me, unless I think anyway. You can't say I don't care what people say about me unless they're saying nice things, in which case I really do. So then, I mean, you have to find a way to filter that praise in a way that, in a way in which you understand, okay, so this is nice. It's nice to have praise, but that these are also people who don't know you. Don't take it personally, for different reasons.
And I'll just end it with my last question. How can journalists today report on stories that involve race and racism in a respectful and informative way?
So it is a good question. And I think ultimately what they have to do is their job. Is do your job. You should be treating everybody respectfully. You should, all of your articles should be well informed. They should be well sourced. Articles should not rely on prejudice or assumption. That you do your job. And if you're doing your job well, then you will take care of the aspects that are about race or about sexual orientation or gender or class. But it involves you doing your job well, which means asking questions and keeping on asking questions. And it also means kind of engaging with those moments where you might have got it wrong, even if you were very well intentioned. So an example would be, I went to Scarborough with a 2010 election. I think I went to Scarborough with a videographer. We were looking at how gay life had changed under Labour, in the 13 years under Labour. And the videographer thing is important because there was a drag night on the night. We were there for 2 nights, and on one night there was a drag night, which is good pictures, right? But you can then be like, well, it's good pictures. What are you going to do? You know, if there was a black and white minstrel show, would you do that too? Well, no. So I'm not saying that that is what drag is. I'm just saying, like, you can't just hide behind that. And the videographer raised it, to his credit. It wasn't me who raised it. He said, look, I just wonder, are we being stereotypical? Are we being... And I said to him, I think we should do this. And I think that the question is what else we do, and whether we, you know, whether... And so we did do it. And we also spoke to lots of gay people in the town and straight people too. And then we put it together. And the drag evening was an element of it, but it wasn't by any means the main thing. And someone came, I don't want to say came at me, but criticized it. So I can't believe you go to Strawberry. And I was able to say, yeah, we thought about that. And we did talk about that. And we thought that given the balance of the piece, we thought it would work. But I hear you, and so, and that's the open heart and thick skin thing. That's about, like, you don't always get it right.
Thank you. Thank you, Oliver, Sasha, and Georgia. Thank you for your questions. So there are a few questions coming in, Gary, for you. So obviously election week in the UK, also election kind of coming up in the US as well. So the question is, do you believe that racial and class issues are crossroads at this time of kind of electoral potential change, and what can journalists do to responsibly report on these matters in terms of racial and class issues?
I'm not entirely sure what is meant by at a crossroads. I think that both of those issues are key and have been for some time. The political class are fond of saying it's not racist to talk about immigration. That's true, but it is racist if you talk about it in a racist way. It is racist if you talk about it in a way that discriminates against and not between people. If the conversation about immigration is different when you're talking about Australians and South Africans and Americans than it is about Somalis, then I'm afraid it is racist. And that also means making people accountable for the things that they say, which is where I think journalists have fallen down with Farage. So there's never been an election in my lifetime where race and class issues aren't central in some way. The first election I remember is 1979. That was Thatcher, who got a big boost, saying, people fear that we'll be swamped by an alien tide. By 83, there'd been the 81 riots. There'd been riots in 85 and 87. It's always been an issue, and of course, class is embedded in British society in a way that it could not be an issue, and we don't talk about either of those things particularly intelligently. when it comes to journalists responsibly reporting on those matters, I go back to Sasha's last question. Do it well, do it properly, do it intelligently, do it sensitively. That's as true if you're reporting on the Jewish community as if you're reporting on the Muslim community. That it's not good enough to say, well, Muslims are really, really exercised about Gaza, when all the polls show that lots of people are exercised about Gaza. And so to sort of single it out like it's a Muslim issue is kind of is poor, I think, as an example. So yeah, that it's always worth remembering, I think, that the Windrush scandal, the story of the Windrush scandal, was broken by someone who went to private school, a white woman who went to private school in Oxford and is Boris Johnson's sister-in-law. She was doing her job. And that's all you can really ask of people.
So I also just want to ask you from, I suppose, because the John Schofield Trust really, like say, the kind of core mission is to improve diversity in newsrooms, and I know you're probably kind of maybe a step away really from newsrooms in terms of what you actually do day to day at the current time. But do you think that is still a problem within newsrooms, and what would you like to? What do you think could be done about it? I mean, just in terms of the output that maybe you read or watch on news as well.
Yeah.
What's your view?
Well, I think that kind of, and this speaks also to the last question, that, we don't hear a lot about universal credit. I haven't heard a lot about universal credit in this election. Or even about food banks, particularly. It's all kind of, gaff driven and bets this and kind of D-Day that and all that. And that's kind of fine as far as it goes. Well, I don't think it goes very far, to be honest. But that newspaper columnists, as an example, are from a more elite group than lords and high court judges. So the issue of universal credit or free school meals, which very few of them ever had to deal with, is, doesn't emerge in a way that kind of high tax brackets and so and so says they're leaving for Florida and all that kind of stuff does. And we are all poorer for it. And when I'm in a newsroom, when I was in newsrooms, I would often hear these kind of rarefied conversations. And they didn't seem rarefied because the political class and the media class are kind of all come from the same social class, more or less. But I would think, like, I don't know that anybody beyond you all is really kind of talking about that. So we get this kind of very fetid ecosystem with people speaking to each other and this kind of revolving door where you go from being prime minister to having your own show on GB News, and then you've got a column in the Mail, and then he might be an MP again, and so or George Osborne and what's his name having a podcast. So it all becomes kind of jokes and bands, and meanwhile people are choosing between eating and eating. So I think it's a real problem. And one of the challenges that news organizations have is that all of this keeps going to HR. Like it's an HR problem. And it's actually also an editorial problem. It shapes the news that they provide. It shapes what they think is news. That, if people have heard my talks before, they might have heard me say this, that when I was at City, we learned when a dog bites a man, it's like as though there were no women in the world. When a dog bites a man, that's not a story. When a man bites a dog, it's a story. And increasingly, I've always thought, well, sometimes you have to ask yourself, who owns these dogs? And why do these people keep getting bitten? Why are the things that journalists think, well, that's not a story? Why do they keep happening? George Floyd, there hasn't been a spike in the number of black people who've been killed by the police in America. What there's been a spike in is journalists understanding that to be a story. It's not news in a traditional sense. It's not new to the communities. It's not new in any traditional sense, apart from that journalists have finally decided that, yeah, maybe there's something up there.
Okay, thank you. There's a quite a specific question. I think it goes back to your message in terms of being professional and respectful and doing the job well. So Norma has a question, which was that in 2017 you interviewed Richard Spencer for a documentary about the roots of racism in America. So what tips do you have for interviewing someone who's trying to bait you in a race debate, and how did you hold your composure when he's being so blunt about his own racism? So that's a reference to Richard Spencer.
Well, it's a very good question, because there are lots of people who think I didn't hold my cool, and I'm not even sure. I think I held my. I mean, I didn't really flip one, but that first of all, you have to ask yourself, why am I interviewing this person at all? Which I think, even in the case of Richard Spencer, is a perfectly valid question. Why are you interviewing him in the first place? I didn't realize that his racism was going to be quite so baroque. I'm used to a more sophistication with my racism than he had. So I didn't go into that interview. I thought it was going to be trickier. I didn't realize he was just going to show his answer the way that he did. And I walked off. And I didn't just walk off for the cameras. I'm like, I don't need this. I don't need to be, you're not saying anything useful. I don't generally argue with people that I'm interviewing. I try and draw them out. When I was in America, Republicans would often call me and be like, thank you. I really they'd see the piece and they would feel like, yeah, I feel really heard. Because I think, well, this is what they said, and I don't want to lampoon them. I don't want to. So first of all, you have to show respect to people and not sort of goad them yourself, which a lot of journalists do. And then I think if you are feeling like disrespected, then that's probably the time to leave. And if you look at that interview with Richard Spencer, which went sort of viral online, I do try and redirect him quite a bit. Why do you think that? Where is that? What? But it all gets stuck because he kept saying, well, you're not English, you're not British. And it's just like, dude, can we move on? Can we talk about something else? Like, I know where I'm from. I think you have to be really clear about why you're doing it in the first place, and what you want out of it, and you have to make an assessment about whether it's worth it. There came a point in that interview and I just thought, it's not worth it. And some people said, well, that's really unprofessional, that you shouldn't walk away from it. And I think, well, first of all, I'm not being paid to be racially abused. And secondly, no, interviews don't go on forever and ever and ever. They stop somehow. And if someone just wants to keep on talking because they're lonely, at some point you have to say, look, we're done. And I explained to him and the viewer, I was looking for someone who could explain this. You can't, so I'm off. So I think I'd kind of I'd made the case. But what's always important to remember when you're interviewing these people is they're not your friends. So there's no point in getting upset about, I can't believe you said that. That is so upset, because they're not your friends. They are subjects. And that's as true for people you agree with as people you don't agree with. And That doesn't mean that you therefore have to treat them like they're your enemies, but it's only if they are being personally abusive that you might take it personally. Otherwise, your job is one of becomes one of a form of extraction.
Okay, can I just maybe just one more? I know we just at past, but I think this one just might be again just it's quite indicative of the industry at the moment, which obviously, you know, is a lot of shedding of jobs right across news organizations, a lot of threat to local journalism as well. So there's a question, just for those people who are really committed to producing original journalism and maybe freelancers, maybe working outside of London, do you have any advice into how they can financially support their work and stay committed to producing original journalism?
I mean, in one sense, that gets harder and harder, I think, because getting people to pay for journalism is increasingly difficult. On another sense, there are more platforms than there's ever been, and so the gatekeeping is less rigorous. And I think I've never been a freelancer. I mean, I do freelance work now, but I'm a full-time professor now, so I've never had to, beyond maybe a couple of months, just rely on journalism for all of my income. But I would say, like, study the field, because the field is big, and there are I'm sure places where you might put your work that you haven't thought of, places that you might put your work you haven't heard of even, and ways of framing your work that work for you, but also work for another institution. And I would also say, don't be shy of having the kind of journalist type job that pays your bills so that you can do other things. And by which I mean writing reports for Runnymede Trust, or you know, doing these things which aren't strictly speaking journalism, but they're also not PR. They're not kind of you will learn something, but it's paying your rent, and it gives you the space then to pursue the things that you really want to do. But it's hard. It's hard, and in many ways, it's getting harder.
And just on the back of that, do you think it's important to challenge editors? You've mentioned that in terms of having to walk around the block and kind of deciding not to undertake an interview, but and it's, especially if you feel that you have an original story that isn't being told, or telling it from a different perspective, and any publication or news outlet may have a specific objective or a political line, basically, or has its own editorial stance. But do you think it's important, given how people may feel about their own job security and not rocking the boat? Do you still think it's important to challenge editors?
Well, not indiscriminately. I mean, I was in journalism for 26 years. No, more than that, really. But let's say 26 years. And I didn't get to be in journalism full-time employed that long by indiscriminately taking on people that I disagreed with. You have to pick your battles. And you have to pick your battles, and you won't win every battle. So you and some of this stuff, going in, like, that, if you're, let's say you're working for the Daily Mail, then you have a sense of what the Daily Mail is going in. And I'm not saying don't work for them. I'm just saying don't then be surprised if the Daily Mail acts like the Daily Mail and says, well, we want you to go and interview this person to do that, and just so, no, you have to be strategic. You do have to be strategic. And sometimes being strategic can be a cover for cowardice. It can be a cover for not actually taking on anything. But is this a big enough issue? Is this a hill that I want to die on? Who is coming in behind me? What do I think the likely outcome is here? Am I prepared to walk? These are all things that you kind of have to bear in mind. I wouldn't want anybody to come away from this thinking I just came in all guns blazing with a set of ideas about the world and was calling out editors left, right, and center, because I was not. I was quite judicious and quite strategic. And I used to say to, and in this case, it was young journalists of color, but it wouldn't have to be. I would say to them at The Guardian when they were pissed off at something that had happened and would go for a little walk, and I'd just say, look, you can resign from this paper, this organization, if you want. And maybe you should. Maybe you've gone as far as you can. Maybe it's too frustrating, it's too humiliating. Maybe you should. But what you can't resign from is white supremacy. Don't think that you're going to go somewhere else, there's going to be no racism, because there will be. So that's what you figure out, like how much you're prepared, what you're prepared to deal with, what you're prepared to put up with, what you and how you want to challenge it. But don't think that walking out the door in itself solves that problem, because you still got to walk in some other door, and you know what, behind that door there will be racism. And it's why when I go back to you know, I think question Sasha asked about kind of, you know, facing challenges from people, and this is about my age, but I grew up in a black family in Stevenage, where there were very few black families, and where, you know, racist abuse was pretty common. And so I don't think that therefore it's okay, or it's just normal, or it's banter or whatever, but I've actually got quite a high threshold before I think, right, that's it, I'm going. Because unless it's from a colleague, that is different. But and you know, if nothing's done about it when the colleague does that, then that is different, because that becomes institutional. But we live in a racist society, we live in a classist society, homophobic, sexist society. This stuff is coming for us, and the question is how you navigate it, how you strategically navigate it, so that you can ultimately be part of defeating it. And there's no single way to do that, but there is, I think, a surefire way not to be able to do that, and that is to unstrategically mouth off at every particular opportunity to people who have more power than you.
That's very sage advice. Thank you, Gary. Thank you. We'll just wrap up there, but thank you so much, Gary, for sharing with us kind of your candid advice and from your many years of experience as a journalist as well, and beyond. I'm sure your daughter will be happy to know she can have her bedroom back now. So thank you very much, Gary. And thank you, Oliver, Sasha, and Georgia as well. And thank you to the audience for joining us as well. Thank you for sharing your insights, Gary. It's much appreciated. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.